Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on how Durban led the country in helping homeless people during lockdown. There's a growing number of Durbanites out there experiencing homelessness on any given night. These people are particularly vulnerable and will be at greater risk if they caught the virus. The general advice to stay at home and to wash your hands and follow all the protocols. It's actually very difficult to do when you're living in the streets. However, we are very, very grateful that a lot of community organizations out there step up to offer much needed poverty relief to those most vulnerable people in our society, like the homeless and destitute people. Despite the limited and also but necessary regulations that were posed by the government in an effort to curb the spread of the virus, a lot of people have actually went out there and lend a hand to those vulnerable individuals in our society. At this point, I would like to welcome all of you, and thanks again for joining us. And allow me to introduce our guest speaker this afternoon, Raymond Perea, who is the director of the Dennis Haley Center. He is also a PhD candidate at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. We're very proud of that. Raymond is involved with the different networks of organizations working to help transform inner city Durban. He has been chair of the eThekwini Task Team on Homelessness and helped set up the National Homeless Network. He was born and educated in the UK, and now stays here in Durban. He holds a BA in philosophy and theology from New College, Oxford, an MA in philosophy from the University of London, and an MSc in human rights from the London School of Economics. The Dennis Haley Center is the community center that in the heart of Durban, working with different faith organizations to help the poor and marginalized people in the city. The landmark building has established its reputation within the city as a place of care, education, and community, responding to issues of refugees, drug addiction, and homelessness. This afternoon, we are hoping to get an overview of current responses, challenges, perhaps strategies that has helped to deal with issues related to homelessness. So I'm going to give, before I give Raymond the platform, I'll request that if you have any questions to use the Q&A session to ask questions, or if you want to send a comment as well. We'll then once he is through with the presentation, we'll then give you an opportunity then to engage with Raymond and ask questions. Colleagues, allow me to welcome our speaker this afternoon, Raymond. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. We are looking forward to your presentation. Thank you, and also sharing with us your experience.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Norma, and good afternoon to everyone who's taken the trouble to join us this afternoon. I was just looking at the list of participants, and I see a number of names there that I recognize. So thank you to old friends and new friends for joining us today. Think back to that shocking announcement made by the President back at the end of March that the whole country would go into a hard lockdown what we later came to call a level 5 lockdown. No movement on the streets, everyone contained in their houses from the end of March, initially for 3 weeks, and of course it ended up being much longer than that. And in the announcement that he made, he said that cities should provide some facility, some emergency shelters, so that homeless people could also observe the lockdown. Easier said than done. We have thousands of homeless people here in Durban and similar numbers in other major cities in South Africa. And where with homes can obviously be locked into their homes during a lockdown, what does one do if one is homeless? Was, by comparison with other cities, really exemplary. And I think Durban as a city deserves a pat on the back for its speed and the effectiveness of its response. And I want to share a little bit with you about how we responded, how the response was as effective as it was, and what's happened since then, because obviously we've gone through many different levels of lockdown since then. We were able to respond much more quickly in Durban for one very important reason, and that's because already we had established a system whereby government officials, NGOs, corporates, and faith-based organizations and academics were already talking to each other about the issues of homelessness. So the eThekwini task team on homelessness had been set up about September 2018 to be not hugely sad to be said, but at least it provided a way of those groups coming together and sharing ideas with each other. From the beginning, the Deputy Mayor of eThekwini, Belinda Scott, who was the chair, who was the instigator of the task team, took it as very much a personal mission to respond to this challenge to provide emergency shelters. And we also had a sense of the scale of the problem we were dealing with. We did a survey at the Dennis Hurley Centre and the other NGOs working with the homeless and with the municipality. We did a survey of homelessness in Durban a few years ago and knew that roughly speaking, we had about 2,000 people sleeping on the streets of central Durban on any given night, and about 2,000 staying in shelters. So we knew what scale of problem we were dealing with, and that the problem was very much centered around the Durban city center. There were some homeless people in outer-lying suburbs, but mostly in central Durban. And so what we set up were a series of emergency shelters. And the emergency shelters, for the majority of people, were tents in parks, but they were buildings provided for those most vulnerable. So all of the women were housed in a building. In fact, ironically, it's a building that had been earmarked as a women's shelter. And thanks to two corporate partners, the property company Urban Lime and the bank FNB, it had been refurbished, ready to be turned into a women's shelter. So that process was just accelerated. So we had a building to house any women who needed to be sheltered. And then we had two shelters specifically for elderly, sick, and disabled men and women from the streets. The men were at the Dennis Hurley Centre itself, and the women at the YMCA. So those most vulnerable groups were not in parks, were not in tents, but rather were in buildings. And then all of the healthy men were housed in parks, sleeping under tents, sleeping in marquees, spaced out in those marquees, using pallets to mark out a sleeping area for each person with blankets and a mattress, and eventually 1,500 people in a series of tent-based shelters, 12 different ones around the city. And key to that was that they were places which were close to where homeless people would normally be, so we were not taking people out of their comfort zone. And importantly, that they were not just sheltered at night, but they had outdoor safe space during the day. You can't lock people away inside a building or inside a tent even for weeks on end and expect them to stay sane and to stay happy. And those emergency shelters, the tent-based structures and the buildings were all set up within the 4 days between the president's announcement and the beginning of lockdown, which meant that when the lockdown began, we immediately had places to put people. And we had a screening process, which was housed at the Durban Exhibition Centre. Sadly, the Exhibition Centre wasn't made available as a place to house people during the lockdown, which was a great missed opportunity. But instead, it was available for the screening process. And so everyone who arrived for screening was checked for any COVID symptoms, of which we didn't have any, was checked for other health issues, particularly TB, and then allocated a shelter based on that. So 2 days of screening. We saw, in fact, all close to 2,000 people through the screening process, and in the end, 1,600 were housed between the tent-based shelters and the buildings I mentioned. Now, once people were safe, obviously we had to make sure that they were kept fed and that they had access to healthcare. If you recall, back at level 5, the only reasons regular folk could leave their homes was to get food or to access healthcare. If we could provide that to people in the shelters, then they wouldn't have a reason to leave. And our key principle here was that if we give people a reason to stay in the shelters, they will do so, and that will keep them safe. As soon as they start wandering out on the streets, they are at risk, obviously, of being arrested for breaking the lockdown, but also at risk of being infected. So we had an extraordinary system in place for feeding people, and it's a real mark of the collaboration of Durban and the interfaith collaboration of how that worked. Literally at one stage, we had a Christian organization providing breakfast, a Hindu business providing lunch, 2 Muslim organizations providing supper, and the Jewish club, which is located near where a number of the shelters were, was providing refreshments to all the people working in the different shelters. So a really phenomenal model of interfaith collaboration. The healthcare, to begin with, was provided by the Dennis Hurley Centre's own mobile clinic, going around to the shelters, and then eventually, by about week 3 or 4, to go out to the shelters and provide healthcare there. And healthcare was important because, as we know from the Dennis Hurley Centre, because we provide healthcare to hundreds of homeless people every week, homeless people suffer from a whole variety of which are simple problems if they're addressed quickly, but can become much more serious. Living on the streets in unsanitary conditions, you could very easily catch an infection, and if you don't take antibiotics soon, that infection can become serious and become very dangerous. So part of the work of the Dennis Hurley to provide primary healthcare for homeless people, and the same was true once we had put help people into the emergency shelters. What was really noticeable about the emergency shelters, certainly compared to other cities, is that nobody was compelled to go to a shelter. Everyone was invited to come along to the screening. We provided transport to bring people, but nobody was forced to come to the screening. Nobody was forced to be in a shelter. And even though we had security in the shelters, we explained to people the security was not to keep people in, but to stop other people from coming in from the outside and potentially bringing in infection. So any homeless person was able to walk out of a shelter at any time, other people at risk. And then, having established a feeding program and a healthcare program, we were then able to provide, again, working in collaboration with other NGOs, with the municipality, and so on, provide access to recreation. Before you lost the photographs, you might have seen some guys playing cricket or playing football or playing chess, project for reselling secondhand books as a way of homeless people making a living. So we were able to provide good reading for people in the shelters. Independent newspapers was providing copies of the Daily News and the Mercury to the shelters. And we even had a team of interfaith chaplains, so chaplains from all the different faith communities working together to provide chaplaincy support, prayerful support, and services on a Sunday morning to homeless people in the shelters. So it was an attempt at a holistic response, that we could provide an environment where people felt safe, where they felt appreciated and where they felt happy. And in many cases, for a number of the homeless people, this was actually a positive outcome. It was a better way of living than some of the circumstances in which they're normally living, looking around for food, or avoiding the police at night for fear that they're going to be arrested, or worse still, beaten up, or have their belongings taken from them. So in many ways, this was quite a transformation. The police were protecting the homeless rather than attacking them. The municipality was providing services to the homeless rather than taking services away from them. And the community-based organizations, the NGOs and the faith-based organizations working together, as we already did, were providing a full range of services. Facing during that period was withdrawal. And if you recall those early days, any of you who are drinkers or smokers may think back to the day when you realized that you were running out of cigarettes or running out of alcohol. Well, obviously the homeless people were going through the same sense of withdrawal, but also for a good number of them, withdrawal from various kinds of narcotics, of drugs, in particular Wunga, which is the main street drug in Durban, which is a low-grade form of heroin. So one of the interventions was to help people through that withdrawal. In the case of some people, they were actually curiously grateful that with a number of them said to me, this is the chance I've been looking for to get off my drug habit. You're going to force me to clean up. You're going to force me to go through the withdrawal and to come out of it on the other side. And even now I see people who come to our center, see them on the streets, and they tell me that they got clean and they've stayed clean throughout this period. For others, the withdrawal was a lot more severe, and we provided some medication to help with some of the symptoms. And for a small group that was particularly identified, an opiate substitution program was set up by Monique Marks at DUT, working with other partners to provide a support for people who were really suffering from very severe withdrawal. And indeed, that's continued as we've gone into level 4, level 3, and now level 2 lockdown. So that's how we were able to keep homeless people safe and more or less happy through level 5, through level 4. When we moved into level 3 at the beginning of June, there was no longer a requirement for homeless people to stay inside the shelters during the day. They still had to be there at night, of course, because of the curfew, and indeed still have to. And so since then, those shelters have become what we've termed safe, open sleeping spaces. So that does mean that people are going out during the day, and if they go out during the day, there is a risk of them becoming infected. They have to observe all the same rules that we all have to do: social distancing and wearing masks and washing hands and all the rest of it. We hope weeks of people being in intense lockdown meant that we had a chance to really help people understand how important it was to take the virus seriously, and to a lot of the homeless guys are now coming and sleeping back in those safe open sleeping shelters through the night, so they have somewhere safe to sleep. The women's shelter has continued, and so that, as I say, was accelerated to make it available for the emergency shelters, and that's now continued. And then the sick, elderly, and homeless who were in the YMCA building and the Dennis Hurley Center, we were able to work with each of those individuals and understand their particular situation, their particular problems, and one by one, they've all been rehoused in other situations. So a good number were able to be repatriated with their families from the beginning of level 3. A number of them have gone into long-term accommodation, into homes who are on old age grants or who are on disability grants, because those grants help fund access to those institutions. And a number of, because we were able to keep them under close supervision, make sure they were taking their medication, and of course eating well, they've all really recovered from their TB, and the medication has worked, and they're now healthy and living their lives again. As far as we know, only one person died throughout this whole exercise. One of the people staying at the Dennis Hurley Center had sadly, despite all of our efforts, his TB got the better of him, and he did die. Conversely, we had 3 births among the women who were in the lockdown program. There were three children were born during that period as well. So most of the homeless who were in the shelters are still in them, and as I say, for most of them, this is a positive outcome. They're in a better situation than they were before. The feeding programs have not returned to how they were operating before the lockdown, but instead the Dennis Hurley Centre is working with a number of faith-based organisations, and we're providing hot lunches for about 500 people every day and distributing them in different locations around the city. And the healthcare, the mobile healthcare program that we've always been running is back in operation and going to where people need help or they're coming to the Hurley Centre. And as I said, the opiate substitute program has continued for those who need it as a way of helping them through their heroin addiction and hopefully helping them to a better life beyond that. The biggest challenge we have now is that those people who were homeless but just about making enough money through casual work, through ad hoc work, of course, are struggling to access work in the way that so many other people are. And what we are beginning to see, sadly, are people who are not homeless but who are hungry because they're not able to access funds to get food for themselves and their families. And a lot of people who were, if you like, just on the bottom rung of the ladder in the last few weeks are now falling off the ladder and looking for services from organisations like us, which are providing help for those people who are right at the very bottom of the ladder. So some positives, some negatives, and just and comment on the funding. And you'll have read something about the funding in the papers. I'm happy to answer questions on that. The majority of the activity was funded by the municipality. They paid for the tents and the security and so on. But quite a lot of the work was funded by the NGOs themselves, by their own donors, and by an appeal that we coordinated on behalf of the NGOs to fund the feeding programs and some of the other activities that happened. So for those of you who donated generously to that COVID appeal, thank you very much. There were individuals, there were corporates, there were grant-making bodies who, between different NGOs, who were providing services, and we're very grateful to the generosity of Durbanites in responding to that. So there's an overview of what we were doing, and I'm happy to continue to share more and also to answer questions.
Thank you so much for Raymond for that comprehensive overview of the work that you do at the Dennis Hurley Centre. I'm just watching out for questions and also for inputs from our audience. I haven't seen anything yet so far. Maybe just to add also, maybe just to also give us an idea of, I know the services that you've covered, most of the services that you offer. Will your services also cover emotional counseling and all of those kind of services within the scope of your services that is offered in the center? Is that something that you also do? And also, if people are willing to come forward to assist, then how do they actually get involved? I'm sure work like this requires also a lot of volunteers.
Yes.
I know people are actually willing. We also, send out calls to assist people that have been, that are destitute or have lost their belongings through various forms. So I'm sure people in the audience also want to find out how they can get involved or volunteer their services and so on.
Yes.
I'll also just check that we've got a few questions that have come through. Go ahead, Raymond.
Yes, happy to answer that and also the questions that are coming up. So during the lockdown period, we did have some excellent psychologists who were volunteering. Obviously, during the periods of levels 5 and 4, lots of people who couldn't work had time on their hands and were keen to help. We were anxious not to have too many volunteers, because obviously every volunteer coming onto a site was a potential source of infection. So we actually had to turn down a lot of general volunteers, but the specialist volunteers, particularly the psychologists and psychotherapists who volunteered, were very well used. Now we're back to a degree of normality and moving around. Then a lot of our regular volunteers are back in place. So the feeding program I mentioned earlier, 500 meals, 5 days a week, that's almost all being run by volunteers to prepare the food, to pack the food, to distribute the food. I'm happy to hear from anyone who wants to volunteer for that. We sadly don't have access to full-time psychological or counseling support, and we're always looking for volunteers in that regard, in particular people who, of course, can counsel people in their own language. And one of the big challenges, I'm afraid, is that very often the people volunteering to do psychological support or counseling are very keen and very well-meaning, but they're not able to communicate with homeless people, a good number of whom are first language Zulu speakers, able to communicate with them in their own language. You can imagine how hard it is to talk about the difficulties in your life, even harder if you're doing so in a language which is not your mother tongue. But this is it's a good opportunity for me to give a big thumbs up to UKZN, because UKZN have been phenomenally supportive of the Dennis Hurley Centre from the moment we were opened 5 years ago. And obviously Dennis Hurley was indeed the Chancellor, or the last Chancellor of the University of Natal, the first of UKZN. So there's a great link there with Dennis Hurley. So we have regularly had fourth year social work students. In fact, we've got a group who have just started work with us again in the last few weeks. We have had occupational therapy students who've been working particularly with the guys with disabilities who are staying at our centre. We've had law students as a part of the street law project. Many thanks to Janine Hicks and her team for making that possible. And we've even had, and we hope we will have again, art students from UKZN teaching drama and music and singing to homeless guys, because there's no reason why they shouldn't have access to that as well. So one of the things which is really commendable, I have to say, in Durban is the willingness of people to volunteer. And my strong sense is that in Durban, people are very keen to volunteer. If you explain to them what you need doing and how you want it done, then people are not slow to put their hand up. Let me just answer some of the questions that have come up. There was a specific question about mental health support. So we did have, as I say, some psychologists providing some interventions on that. Sadly, never enough people for the amount of need. Obviously, there is, as you'd expect, a higher level of mental health problems among homeless people anyway. And of course, as we all experienced, all of that became exacerbated by the sense of crisis of COVID. So we deployed the volunteers we had. We really could always do with many more. And a very good question about how the housed communities reacted. I have a very particular example. One of our shelters was and still is here in North Beach, which is actually where I live, and it's just behind a very large residential building next to the Elangeni Hotel, a place called Grosvenor Court. There might be people tuned in who live in Grosvenor Court. And on about day 2 or day 3 of the lockdown, a very fancy-looking car drove down from Grosvenor Court and turned up at the gates. And I thought, oh my goodness, they're going to come and complain. Quite the opposite. They turned up and said, we've come because we're really impressed at what you're doing, and we want to know what can we do to help. And I thought that was a wonderful sign of the generosity of Durbanites. It would have been so easy for people to complain, an attitude of not in my backyard, but instead, even though we were in their backyard, they saw that as a chance to do something positive and to engage. So most of the homeless are back on the streets. As I say, they're not sleeping on the streets, and that's what the big improvement is, that people are able to sleep in the emergency shelters at night, and therefore not at risk at night in the way that they had been in the past. The main reason people are homeless in Durban is because they can't find work. So the classic source of homelessness in Durban is young men who come to the city looking for work. They don't find work and they end up on the streets. And of course, that's become worse now because of COVID, because there's even less access to casual work. So we are doing what we can. Our secondhand book selling program, for example, is one of the ways in which we're helping people who are homeless to get access to work and to make a living. But given the scale of the problem, it is really hard, I'm afraid, to end homelessness for a lot of these guys. A good number did go back to their families, and it's great that the opportunity of lockdown. I ended up getting quite a lot of messages from people around the country saying, we've heard about what you're doing in Durban. We know that our son went to Durban some years ago. We think he's on the streets. Can you find him for us? Can you reconnect him to us? And we were able to do that in a few cases. The question about homeless children, there's a very, very good organization in Durban called iCare. They work specifically with homeless children. We had no children at all in the emergency shelters because they were all identified before the lockdown even began, and they were taken into the foster homes that iCare run. So the only children we had were children who were with their mothers. We had no solitary children, and that was credit to iCare and their intervention. A question about higher education students. So I mentioned the specific areas we have worked with. We've also had some discussions with the School of Medicine about working with some of the advanced medical students in some of our healthcare work, and particularly with Dr. Bernhard Gader at School of Medicine, we've had those conversations. The most useful interventions for us, I have to say, have been the social work students, because they bring very specific skills. They're often young people of the same age as a lot of the homeless people they're dealing with, and interestingly often come from equally vulnerable backgrounds, and so have a very instant ability to empathize with and develop rapport with the homeless guys, and that's really impressive. And I mentioned earlier the law students. The project the law students have been working on with us for a number of years is helping homeless people understand what their rights are, understand what their responsibilities are as well, but also in a city which certainly up until COVID, a lot of homeless people faced very unpleasant encounters with both the Durban Metro Police and with SAPS, then helping homeless people know when the police are stepping out of line and what to do when they do so. One of the most remarkable changes for me, what's happened during COVID, is to find the very senior officers at both Durban Metro and SAPS are calling me up not to complain about the homeless, but actually to ask how they can help in different ways. And I really do want to commend them for their change of attitude and their change of approach. And I think part of that is that they realize now that by working together, we can actually avoid some of the problems. If you can imagine, if the police's job is to keep the streets safe, then obviously homeless people sleeping in doorways does not leave people feeling safe when they walk around the streets, and that's why the police intervene. So the police have been very supportive of this idea of safe, open sleeping spaces, because their point is that now we're actually giving an alternative to homeless people. So when they're moved on from sleeping in doorways or sleeping on the beach, the police can actually say to them, well, this is a place where you are allowed to go, where you're allowed to sleep all night, you're not breaking the law, and indeed we're providing a better place for you than if you were on the streets or on the beach. Very interesting question somebody asked Joe, hi Joe, about homeless people being reluctant to get help from a shelter. One of the issues with shelter, first of all the shelters in Durban, I should point out, are private institutions. So apart from this women's shelter, which the municipality is now running, until then there were no government-run shelters in Durban. Now that's interesting, because ever since I arrived in Durban 5 years ago, I was repeatedly told by the municipality that the reason they didn't run shelters was because it was illegal for them to run shelters. And I would point out repeatedly that every other municipality in the country runs shelters. So I thought it unlikely that there was a law that's only prevented eThekwini from running shelters. And clearly that law doesn't exist, because eThekwini is now running a shelter, as indeed they should be. Because most of the shelters are commercial operations and they charge 30, 40, 50 rand a night, for a lot of homeless guys, it's money not worth spending. If obviously given the weather in Durban, not so much today, but on most days in Durban, it's more or less tolerable to sleep out in a way that it wouldn't be in other cities. And if you don't have much money, then spending money on a shelter is not necessarily a good option. And the shelters are not necessarily safe or indeed clean, and a number of them are really, really very badly run indeed. So that's why a lot of homeless people are reluctant to use shelters and have had experiences of theft in shelters, had experiences of violence, have had experience of sexual harassment as well. And indeed, Siko, I see you there. Hi, Siko. Siko, let me commend him, is a member of the Umbilo Business Forum and also a member of the Homeless Task Team, and has really demonstrated the commitment of the businesses in Umbilo to work with NGOs and with the municipality to respond to homelessness in that part of the city. And he rightly asked about the problems of gender-based violence in shelters. It's a hidden problem, as sadly it is a hidden problem in so much of South African society. And we have the problem not only in shelters, but also the problem out on the streets. We know that we've repeatedly had problems of gender-based violence perpetrated by the police against young women living on the streets, and even more sadly, often against young women who go into a police station to report one act of violence and end up becoming a victim of a second one. So it's a problem we're aware of. It's something, it's very hard there are no easy answers to that. One of the things that we did start looking at, actually, it was a program we were beginning to develop before lockdown began, was some consciousness work with some of the homeless guys themselves, recognizing that while, of course, they might be victims, they can also be perpetrators of violence, and helping them understand how they can respond, how they can deal with their anger, how they can deal with their frustrations in a way that does not result in violence.
There was another one that was sent via the chat, a person asking about the effect of restoring the dignity of these deprived people, and also just to try to find out if there are any indications of how they were reduced to homelessness, because such information may help to deal with the causes.
Yes, certainly. So as I indicated earlier, the most recurrent reason why people become homeless in Durban, and this was really something we already knew anecdotally, and it was proven by the HSRC survey we did, was this pattern of young men coming to the city, looking for work, not finding work, and ending up on the streets. So that's why the vast majority of homeless people you see in Durban are men, the vast majority are young, and most of them have only been on the streets for under 5 years. So they're relatively new on the streets. And so because of that, one of the remedies, of course, is to try and prevent people becoming homeless when they're struggling to find work. And in fact, we've been working with iCare on a project funded from the UK by the Comic Relief Organization to identify young people, 17, 18, 19-year-olds, young men who are coming into the city looking for work and are at risk of becoming homeless, and trying to make sure that they are taught the skills they need to cope with life and don't end up on the streets. Because obviously, once somebody is on the streets, they're much more vulnerable and much harder to help. A lot of people who are on the streets, you will notice, do suffer from various forms of addiction, alcohol and dagga and harder drugs. It's generally the pattern that it's homeless people who become drug addicts rather than drug addicts who become homeless. That's a big generalization, but if you explore with people what their life story has been, what you often find is that by being on the streets and the misery of living on the streets, they've turned to drugs as a way of trying to cope with that and to deal with the sense of hopelessness and alienation that they face. And so in terms of dignity, so much of what we try to do at the Dennis Hurley Centre, and indeed all the NGOs who work in this field, is not just about responding to need, but responding to need in a way which reinforces dignity. So it's not just about feeding people, but giving people good food, giving people food in a way which we were doing before COVID, where people sit down in a dining room and eat with dignity and respect, giving people access to showers, giving people access to clean clothes, treating people with the respect and the dignity that they deserve. And I think one of the biggest problems that homeless people face is that very soon, because they're constantly treated by other people as pieces of litter, either to be ignored or to be cleared off the street, then they begin to internalize that same experience themselves. And I'll give you a very specific example of that. Some of you may recall the project we did a few years ago, working with independent newspapers, with homeless people selling newspapers at robots. They were selling the Mercury in the morning and the Daily News in the afternoon. And in almost every case, we took people who were already begging at a set of lights and gave them the opportunity to sell newspapers at the same lights. And I remember one of the newspaper vendors doing a talk with me at one of the churches in Durban North, and he was saying, it's very interesting. He said, "Do you know, I actually don't make any more money now than when I was begging," which is rather disappointing. But he said the difference is now the way people treat me. Before, when I was begging, people ignored me. People were driving towards me, and I saw those cars, and they were praying that the lights would stay green so they could zoom past and pretend that I wasn't there. He said now the same people in the same cars look forward to the lights being red so they can stop and wind down the window and ask me how my morning is going. And even if they don't buy a newspaper from me, they've really changed my day because they treat me as a human being. They treat me as a fellow citizen of Durban, not as a problem or as a threat or as something to be ignored. And that really is a key part of the challenge I think we all face, not just working in this field, all of us who live in Durban, is how do we encounter our homeless fellow citizens as fellow citizens? And a piece of advice I always say to people, whether you give to people begging at robots or not is up to you. It's a very personal decision. There are good arguments to give to people, and there are good arguments not to give to people. But one thing that we can all do is wind down the window and greet somebody and say hello and ask them how their day is going. And it makes a huge difference because suddenly they become a person, they become somebody with dignity. And if we treat them with dignity, they begin to treat themselves with dignity, and they begin to turn their lives around. So that's something I really would commend people to do. Some other questions have come up about access for services for pregnant street women. I know that there are a couple of women who are pregnant who are at the women's shelter in central Durban, and we see a number of pregnant street women through our clinic at the Dennis Hurley Centre, and obviously then ensure they're getting access to both antenatal and postnatal care through the government health system. Margaret, you ask quite rightly about the people living in around the estuary and in Durban North, in the dunes there. There has indeed been some heavy-handed intervention there. It's unfortunately one of the big challenges we have working with different government departments is that they're stretched. They have no particular reason to have empathy with the homeless any more so than most ordinary Durbanites do. They're given a job to do and they go in to do it, and often see the problem rather than the people behind the problem. Is that there is always a task of raising people's awareness, helping people to understand that no matter how difficult somebody is, no matter how problematic they are still a human being and deserve to be treated with dignity. And what's more, if you treat somebody with dignity, you're actually more likely to get them to cooperate with you and to do whatever it is you're trying to do, than if you treat them as an obstacle when they're more likely to be resistant. So the safe open sleeping spaces have provided the beginning of a response to that. It means that now when the DSW trucks are sent in to clear people away, they can actually give people an alternative. But there was absolutely no reason why the municipality feels it should feel it has the right to take people's belongings, to trash their belongings, which it regularly does, to trash their ID documents, which it has done in the past. And unfortunately, that often happens because the instructions that go out either are very blunt, or the implementation of those instructions are somewhat crude, and don't accommodate the humanity of the people they're dealing with.
Okay, thank you so much, Raymond, for your time, and also for giving us quite a broad understanding of what's happening in the center and the work that you're doing with the homelessness. There's a lot of people that have actually shared also that they are working with other organizations to offer their services and offer meals to homeless people. So it's quite encouraging to see that a lot of people have come together to actually assist, and also to ensure that we don't leave our most vulnerable members of our society destitute. So I'd like to thank everyone who have made the time to actually join us this afternoon, and to you, Raymond, for making the time to actually share with us, enlightening us about the work that you're doing. It is clear that the power of interfaith collaborations and partnerships in general with various organizations played a major role in all these interventions. So let's continue to work together, and also finding, I mean, as you said, that, I mean, the UKZN students are involved in a lot of the work that you do. It's actually clear that, I mean, by working together, because sometimes it's not all about money, it's also about the services that we can offer that are needed. I mean, I know that, I mean, you actually, as you said, psychological counseling, it's needed. And I mean, you're already working with our social work department as well. So there's a lot that, I mean, as a university, that we can do to assist our community, because university belongs to the community, and our students are always eager to learn, and also to work with other organizations, because we have a lot of students also that run their own organization, community-based organizations, and they are doing a lot of work in our communities, and we are very, very proud of. We are very, very proud of that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us again. It's really a pleasure to see, and also to give us the opportunity to host you this afternoon. And there's a lot of people that have asked for Raymond's details. Those details, I mean, we can share those via the alumni office, and Mcebo will email the details to people who require those details, and also so that we can connect you directly with Raymond, and then you can figure out how you're going to work or offer your assistance. Was there anything else, Raymond? I thought you were saying something.
Yes, please. Yes, if I could just tie up some threads. I've put my email address on the chat, so you can pick it up from there. Please, I do encourage you, if you're not already, follow us on Facebook, and or have a look at our website. If you want to receive a regular newsletter from us, then drop me a line, and we'll add you to our mailing list. Specific ways of helping. At the moment, we really do have enough volunteers for feeding, but if you have specialist skills, particularly medical skills, psychological skills, social work skills, we really do want to hear from you. I'm delighted to see somebody from the psychology department has already posted a desire to help involving students. Definitely, please do get in touch. We'd love to talk more about that. But there's something that everyone can do, and that's tied in with our book selling program. So as I've said before, one of the main reasons why homeless people are on the streets is because they can't find work and can't afford accommodation. Every single one of our booksellers, and credit to my colleagues Stuart Talbot and Illa Thompson, who run this program, are now off the streets, living, paying for their own rooms, or in some cases now actually paying for their own for their own flats. So they have turned their lives around by selling books that would otherwise have been thrown away and turned to pulp. We don't need your books at the moment, so please don't inundate me with books. What we do need are people to buy books, and we need places to sell books. So please, let's start speaking about places where we can sell books. I know, Norma, we started doing that at Howard before lockdown. Please, would love to have a bookseller back on campus selling books. This is a fantastic opportunity for people to get access to really quality fiction and non-fiction for 10, 20 rand a book. Absolutely fantastic books. But if you run a business and you'd like our bookseller to come in, suitably masked and sanitized, and sell books to your staff, we would happily do so. If you're running any kind of organization where we can sell, because as you can imagine, the places where we normally sold, in churches and concerts and conferences and so on, those are not happening at the moment. So we're struggling with those. And if you see a bookseller at the Berea Centre, at the Pick and Pay at Durban Hyper, and other places around the city, please buy some books and encourage them in that way. And the other thing I would like to say, if you want to help us, please do get in touch first. Sometimes people think they know what will be helpful, and they turn up at my door with something which is entirely inappropriate, and then get rather offended when I point out to them that what they're offering is not really that helpful. So please give me a call, drop me a line. If you're thinking something might be useful, then let's discuss it first, and it might be, or we can make it more useful, or I can direct you to other organizations that can make use of your generosity. So please always contact us first. A credit to all the other organizations that are doing great work. It is the collaboration in Durban that makes a big difference. And really, I see when I talk to my colleagues in the National Homeless Network, we are a much more collaborative city in this regard than any other. And then we're just one part of a whole wealth of NGOs who are doing work for the poorest of the poor in Durban. All the organizations providing food hampers to poor families, organizations providing help to young people in children's homes and so on. There were so many other activities going on. So there are plenty of ways to help and plenty of people in need of help. And finally, just to say thanks so much, and I'm sure that Dennis Hurley is looking at us from beyond, and of course Paddy Carney, also an alumnus of the university, and indeed an honorary doctorate of UKZN, looking at us from above, and I hope smiling at what we're doing and smiling at the collaboration between the Dennis Hurley Centre and UKZN, and long may that continue.
Thank you so much, Raymond. We're looking forward to your graduation as well, hopefully soon. I think people have received the message about what it's needed, and also how they can get in touch. We'll also share the details with them during the course of this week, especially those who have requested specific things. I think we all made note of what people are requesting, and I think we'll continue to work with the center, because obviously it's part of what we do at UKZN, and most of the services that are offered, it's something that is services that we actually have. And also looking forward to also getting those books back on campus as soon as we start, as soon as the lockdown is over. For those, because at the moment we still have to practice social distancing, but there's also other areas where other students also that have started selling books online. We also are going to explore that as well, and see if we can incorporate those books into those platforms as well. Thank you, Raymond, for your time and your generosity. Looking forward to working together with you and the team. I'm going to then, I think we've come to an end of the session. I was just looking to see if there's any message that I need to point out. Thank you to my team who have organized this, the Alumni Office. Shakila, Koliswa, thank you for making sure that this discussion this afternoon is a success, and hopefully we'll see all of you again in other platforms. UKZN has been running a lot of webinars on various topics. So watch the space, and we'll love to host you again. Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy your day and stay warm and keep safe.